Hi, and welcome to the Debrief. I'm Donna King, editor-in-chief of Carolina Journal. Every week right here on the Debrief, we break down all the stories that are making headlines, but giving you a little more in-depth analysis about the politics and the policy behind those headlines. So joining us this week, we have, of course, Mitch Kokai, senior policy analyst for the John Locke Foundation, and Dr. Andy Jackson, director of the Civitas Center for Public Integrity. So we're going to be talking about all these things. Among the things we're going to be talking about is going to be the new congressional maps that were passed this week by the General Assembly, the Medicaid rebase impasse that we've been talking all about. So stick around. We're going to be talking more. Let's start with these new congressional districts, Dr. Jackson. You can see the story on Carolina Journal and on johnlocke.org. Lots of great work that you've been publishing. Lawmakers have approved new congressional districts. They reshape kind of the eastern part of North Carolina's political boundaries for Congress. Walk us through what this new map means. What does it do to those district lines?
Yeah. Well, basically what they did is they took the first district and they added a bunch of coastal counties. They basically ran down the coast a little bit inland there. Basically, they used Pitt County, which is Greenville, as a pivot point.
Sure.
And they raced down, grabbed about 6 counties there, including a little tiny snippet of Onslow County. And in exchange, they moved 4 inland counties with a slightly higher population from the 3rd up to the 1st. And the net effect of that is they shifted from having the 1st district basically being a complete toss-up even district to being what I have in my analysis found is an R5. Republicans have a 5-point advantage, or they will end up with 5% above 50%. And also the 3rd has gone from an R9 down to an R5. So there's been kind of this shift to having, instead of having one very competitive district and one that is relatively safe for the Republicans, we now have 2 districts that are generally going to favor Republicans, but in a very good Democratic year, if the Democrats nominate good candidates, both of those could be competitive.
Well, that's really interesting because one of the things that we've been hearing a lot about, at least I've been hearing in some of the other news outlets, is that they locked down another seat for Republicans. So now these both are going to lean Republican, but they could be more competitive. It seems like Greg Murphy's district could be a little more competitive.
Well, yeah, definitely more competitive than it was.
Sure.
Now, in most elections, all things being equal, Republicans are going to win these districts. So you kind of still need things to line up for Democrats to win. But 2026, it's a presidential midterm a year with Donald Trump. Republicans lost 40 seats the last time Donald Trump was president in a midterm election. So that's worth a couple of points right there.
Okay.
When Don Davis says he's going to be running for re-election, he's an incumbent. That might be worth a couple of points there. And now you're in range, depending on who the Republicans nominate to run against him, the other circumstances of the race. Greg Murphy, being an incumbent Republican, he's already said he's going to run again in the 3rd. He is probably going to win, but once again, if the Democrats nominate somebody good and they have some really strong tailwinds, once again, that could be an interesting race.
Sure. Now, could we see people change who's running from where? I think Greg Murphy lives in Greene County. It doesn't matter. You can run wherever you want, but do you think we'll see some shuffling?
I would guess not, but they could.
Okay.
We won't know the final answer of this until candidate filing in December.
Sure.
There could be a kind of dance around that, but these districts are very close to each other in their partisan composition, and so there's a reasonable argument to be made for both of them. They both now live in the 3rd district.
Right.
Once again, the Constitution, lays out the rules, and you don't have to live in the district to run for Congress. So both of them could run in the 1st. Both of them have represented significant parts of the 1st district. So they have a good reason to run in either district.
Sure. Now, there's been some rumblings that we're still going to see some litigation filed over this. Seems to be, even overtly, they're talking about that this is to lock down Republican representation and to counteract what we're seeing happen with Gavin Newsom in California, abandoning an independent redistricting commission so they can get some more Democrat seats through 2030. So clearly partisan, openly kind of a partisan process. The court has said it's not going to weigh in on partisan, but we might still see litigation.
Well, we certainly will see some sort of litigation impact. I'm not sure if we're going to see a fresh lawsuit.
Okay.
We might. It would not surprise me at all. And in fact, a lot of the condemnation that you'd heard about this was along the lines of, oh, this is racial gerrymandering, you're targeting black voters, which is exactly the type of thing that you would argue if you were going to file a lawsuit of this sort. Because the only thing that the courts will deal with now, well, there are really only two things that they'll deal with on redistricting cases. One is malapportionment, where you say that there are too few people in one district, too many in another district, so it spoils one person, one vote. You definitely don't get that on the congressional map because it's down to the exact same number of people in every district, except maybe one district will have one more or one fewer person because you don't have an even number of people to split among the 14 districts. So malapportionment's not going to work. The only other thing that might work is a racial gerrymandering claim. Now, as we're talking, there's been no word of any new lawsuit being filed, but we have heard about two lingering cases that are out there that deal with the old congressional map, the one that was used for this last election. There was a trial held over the summer on two different cases. One is led by the NAACP and Common Cause. Another one is led by plaintiffs working with Democratic operative Mark Elias's law firm. Both of them involve challenges to the congressional map. One of them also involves challenges to the state House and state Senate maps. But in both cases, they're arguing racial gerrymandering. And the three judges who are overseeing that case on Thursday, actually on Wednesday, put out a text order to the parties saying, there's a new congressional map. You need to file new briefs by Monday afternoon telling us what this means for these cases, including does it make any of the arguments moot. My guess is that the plaintiffs who are challenging these cases say, no, this is just as bad, if not worse, than what we were arguing before. And the Republicans will say, yes, it's moot because the arguments weren't valid in the first place and they're less valid now than they were before. We didn't use race. This was all about party. Back to your earlier point, it was very interesting to me that as this whole process started, the Republicans were very open and clear about what they were doing. They said Donald Trump called on Republican legislatures to try to come up with more Republican seats in the State House of Representatives. We are heeding that call. We're doing that to counteract what Gavin Newsom and Democrats are doing in California. They are definitely setting this up as this is all about partisanship. This is all about helping Republicans win more seats. And the reason that they could be open about that is because, as you alluded to, the courts have said they're no longer taking up partisan gerrymandering cases. They say that's a political question. It's not something for the courts to deal with. If people don't like the fact that they're gerrymandering to make things more partisan, well, you can elect new people. Just because the map says it's favoring a Republican, or in states where the Democrats do the gerrymandering, just because the map says it favors the Democrats. If you don't like that, you can vote against those parties. And in fact, one of the things that Republicans in North Carolina have said over and over again is, remember, we got control of the General Assembly in the 2010 election by winning under maps drawn by Democrats and drawn to gerrymander in favor of Democrats. We won because we had better candidates, better ideas, so on and so forth. Democrats can't say that they're losing only because of the maps. They're also losing because they don't have good candidates and they don't have good ideas. That's the Republican argument.
And actually, he alluded to this. We've been fighting about this in courts for almost 2 decades, I guess.
Longer than that. Yes,
right?
It goes back.
That Snake
District. Yeah, the Snake District came about in the early 90s, but there are older cases than that. Ever since Republicans became competitive in North Carolina, there have been fights about redistricting in this state. Democrats knew that if they drew districts that made sense and looked good, that Republicans would have a better chance. So they made that crazy Snake District, which originally was Durham to Gastonia. Eventually, it went Greensboro to Charlotte, which was still bad, but it was better than Durham to Gastonia. But that was their solution, to get the second majority-minority district while still keeping much of the map Democratic. And even in the first iterations of what Republicans did, they kept that crazy 12th district because they thought, well, I mean, the courts have approved it, so might as well.
Sure.
And then only eventually, after their maps were thrown out, did they say, okay, well, let's make this a little more sensible. They made a district that was very consolidated around Charlotte, and they made a triangle district that was very Democratic, and then made the rest of the districts more Republican. But this is something that's been going on for decades, and I assume as long as North Carolina is a competitive state, this will be an issue going forward continually, unless they ever decide to put forward some sort of commission, which would not take politics out of it, but would just inject politics in a new way.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about that, because you've been studying this for a long time. Do we need reforms in this process?
I think we do.
Okay.
And this is something that the John Locke Foundation has been advocating for years.
Sure.
I mean, so this is certainly not new. We came out with a report on redistricting reform back in 2023. And we don't necessarily think that it needs to be a commission that draws the districts, but what we think is you need to have a stricter enforcement of traditional redistricting criteria, such as not splitting counties unnecessarily, avoiding splitting municipalities, avoiding splitting precincts more than is absolutely necessary, compactness, making districts reasonably compact, within the confines of keeping counties whole.
Sure.
And really, and all those things done together, when you combine them and you enforce them strictly, and you don't include any partisan data. One of the advancements that we've had over the last decade is that we don't use racial data in redistricting anymore, and that has really helped survive lawsuits in some of these cases. We really should pull out that partisan data, especially election results, that help the party in power kind of fine-tune their gerrymandering. And without those, and you just strictly try to use congressional districts to represent areas and the people in those areas rather than have a predetermined target that you're going for. Usually in North Carolina, considering that we're a slightly Republican state in our voting patterns and the settlement patterns in the state, a kind of a natural map in North Carolina is usually either an 8-6 or a 9-5 Republican map. There was a court-imposed map that was a 7-7 map, and that was just as much a gerrymander as this current 11-3. It was an artificial party-based target, and they said, well, we're going to divide. In that case, they took Charlotte and just cleaved it asunder, right in half, and divided it in so they could get an additional Democratic district there. I think if we can do that in North Carolina, we can have districts that are fully, or at least better representative of the people of the area rather than just the interest of the parties. Is it easy to implement? Certainly not, because the party in power wants to stay in power. We saw this, the flip side, when Democrats controlled the judiciary, at least the Supreme Court, that we ended up with a map that benefited Democrats with that 7-7 map. That is not a natural construction in North Carolina. Probably the most likely way we could get it if there is a real belief that this could come back and bite us. So either Republicans think, well, the 2030 election might go against us just like the 2010 went against Democrats, or if there is a real threat that Democrats could come in and take power in the Supreme Court again within the next several years, which is mathematically possible. Either one of those scenarios could result in maps that would really hurt Republicans. So it'd be better to go ahead and institute reforms now rather than wait for the other side to use the same tools that we have been using.
Sure. Now, are you putting this together in a proposal or a study? Tell me what you're...
Well, we actually did a study back in 2023. So anybody that's interested in seeing that, it is posted at our webpage. And I will put it out on X again.
Good.
And so for anybody's reading pleasure, in the long term, we may have to advocate for this at a national level, either with an act of Congress where you have similar sets of rules in either state. Either, if you have these rules, you enforce them. It's a mechanism that courts would have to enforce. So at that point, you don't really have to bring in a commission. You could still have state legislators do it because they know the courts would be, watching over their shoulder. Or you could do an interstate compact. There are ways to accomplish this, and then you could avoid these kind of tit for tat redistricting fights that we have going on now.
Right. Well, we're seeing California, Texas here, that kind of thing. Well, it's been a big, long road to this, certainly not over. We'll be following it further on carolinajournal.com and, of course, on johnlocke.org. Let's talk about this impasse about Medicaid rebates. This is so in the weeds, and it has been such a challenge to really follow. But we're seeing the state legislative chambers, each passing their own version of this. The price tag is going crazy on this. I think the last estimate from John Locke's fiscal research folks is that if the Senate were to pass everything the House has already passed, we're looking at $800-900 million. That's more than Department of Health and Human Services even asked for. This seems like it is political gamesmanship, but in the end, who wins in this? What do you think?
Well, no one wins.
Right.
Taxpayers ultimately lose, which is the John Locke Foundation has many opportunities to go back and say, we told you so on anything involving Medicaid where you think you're going to end up saving money and help the taxpayers, because that never happens with that program. The interesting thing to me on this is that the General Assembly came back to town mainly to deal with the congressional map, but dealt with some other issues. And one thing that they did, that they agreed to, got through the Senate fairly quickly, got through the House fairly quickly, was another one of these mini budgets that dealt with some of these things that are not covered in the mini budgets that have already been passed, since we don't have a comprehensive new state budget, and there's no likelihood anytime soon of there being one. But they found agreement on this mini budget. That was done. Not really a whole lot of talk about it. But at the same time, they weren't able to come to an agreement on what to do about Medicaid, and had not only competing plans, but then competing comments about each other's plans. The state Senate came in Monday. By Tuesday, they were done and gone. They sent the House a plan that had dealing with this Medicaid rebase, which means not any sort of expansion, but this is how much more we're going to have to spend to cover what we've already said we're going to do. And they said, well, we're taking the House's position on this, but the House needs to accept a couple of the things that we want to do. They sent them a bill that did that. House didn't take up that bill. The House instead passed its own Medicaid rebase bill that had bipartisan support. And so they're on two opposite sides.
I think they were unanimous.
But by the time they passed that, the Senate was already gone. So basically, the idea was, well, this is what we are going to do, take it or leave it. And on the other side, the same thing. This is what we're going to do, take it or leave it. Well, they both left, not doing anything about it. And of course, they're getting criticism from the Democrats, from Governor Stein, saying, look, we're cutting providers, and this is going to be a mess if you don't do anything about it. Of course, that's also political gamesmanship, because the General Assembly has said, you don't really need to make any cuts right now, Governor Stein. You could wait. And his argument has been, well, if I wait, you're still not going to come to an agreement. We need to make the cuts now, or else we're going to have to make greater cuts later. It seems to me that if they really thought they needed to do something, they would do it. They would rather play political games about it now and just pass the things they can agree on, which they did in the mini budget.
Right. This is a really hard thing to watch, because Medicaid expansion is not part of the rebase. The rebase being like what we think it's going to cost and then what it actually ended up costing. But it does sort of reveal that this is a fragile system, that it seems like things like Medicaid expansion have really stretched it thin. Tell me what your thoughts are about what you're seeing and all this happening.
Well, that's an issue that we're getting. And as Mitch talked about there, we basically, the Department of Health and Human Services made these anticipatory cuts that they don't have to make at the moment, because they're saying, well, we can't count on the General Assembly delivering this rebase funding.
So far, they're right.
So far,
and so, when you get into the second half of the fiscal year, then and they still haven't passed it, then we would definitely be in serious trouble then on our budget front. But this is going to be an issue that's going to continue to come back to North Carolina, especially if the federal government does a retreat from Medicaid expansion. That is something. Now, in theory, the General Assembly already has an exit clause written in, but the political pressure for them to go ahead and start expanding that funding is going to be enormous. So the Medicaid expansion was considered by many to be a Trojan horse. The federal government is going to say, oh, we'll cover almost all of the expansion. And then it gets in, and then they're just going to take the football away, and you're just going to end up flipping down the field. So this is a problem that North Carolina is probably going to have to deal with over and over and over again. And kind of like with the federal budget impasse with the government shutdown we have now, this is going to be an issue with the rebase and other Medicaid issues that we're probably going to see year in and year out, because it's just such a large expense, and it's only going to get larger as the population gets bigger and gets older.
Sure.
And one of the things that I think Republicans kind of lost sight of was the fact that when they took over the General Assembly in 2011, Medicaid was a mess.
Right.
It was growing year to year, and not only was it growing, you just didn't have any idea how much it was going to grow. And that started to eat into other things like education or keeping the prisons open, everything else that you wanted to spend money on, or giving tax relief. Anything that you wanted to do involving tax dollars was affected by the fact that Medicaid was costing a lot more than anyone could even anticipate. Now, the Republican General Assembly eventually got a lid on that and started to get some controls, but then I think they forgot about that by the time they got to expansion and said, yeah, we'll do Medicaid expansion with the federal government covering 90% of the bill and the hospitals covering the other 10%, since they're going to be making money on the deal anyway. I think some of those issues are coming back to haunt them now. This rebase issue might have been something that would have cropped up regardless of expansion, but certainly the decision to expand and the decision to rely much more on Medicaid to provide services for health insurance services for people across North Carolina. Because remember, once Medicaid expanded, there were also more people signing on to it because small businesses said, well, I don't have to do it anymore. Let the government take care of it.
Yeah, people moved from private insurance to Medicaid.
Right. So more and more people relying on Medicaid. That means that if you make cuts, you're going to be affecting more and more people. And I think the General Assembly has not yet come to grips with the fact that they got to do something. They're willing to pass these mini budgets on things that they can agree on, but this is something that they've not yet decided we have to do something. And at some point, as Andy said, they're going to have to decide that we have to do it.
Just kicking the can down the road. One thing that did pop up this week is that there's a new figure hitting a milestone for the Opportunity Scholarship Program. 96,000 kids. We're almost 100,000 students taking advantage of the Opportunity Scholarship Program here in North Carolina. It's a tax-funded program for families who apply and qualify. It's a sliding scale by income, how much you get and whether you get anything, truthfully. Although anybody can apply, not anybody can get it. The folks who need it the most are served first. The poorest kids who are already in the program are served first, those kind of things. So it is one of those programs that's gotten some criticism because anybody can apply, more or less anybody can apply. Not everybody can get it. It's definitely serving lowest income families first. But this milestone shows it's popular. The majority of kids are always going to go in traditional schools, but it shows that there is a need or there is a desire for families who can't afford an alternative to be able to use it.
Yeah, there's been pent-up demand for something like this for a long time. And it was interesting that within the last couple of years, the General Assembly passed universal school choice by expanding the eligibility to anyone. But it was universal school choice with an asterisk because they didn't have enough money to cover all of the people who wanted to use this. And that was a source of debate. Remember that we, in recent years, that they had to come back, put in several $100 million more to cover the people who are on the wait list. Now I think the funding is spelled out going forward in such a way that it's probably going to cover much or most, if not all, of the people who apply for it. And that will show that there are more and more parents who see a private education option as the best one for their kids. Wealthy families have always had school choice.
Right.
They've paid the taxes for the public schools and then paid the full freight for sending their kids to private schools, probably grumbling about it,
Sure.
but realizing this is the best option. Middle class families, families with lower means, have not had school choice. They've been stuck with whatever school they were assigned to. If they lucked out and it was a good school, great. If they were in a school that was not as good, too bad.
Right.
Having this option for them makes things better for everyone. It also makes things better at the public schools, because the traditional public schools, because they're going to have to compete.
Right.
In the past, they didn't have to. They had everyone coming to them.
Sure.
If they were good, great. If they weren't good, it wasn't a problem for them because they were still getting funded. They were still getting all the kids. If students have an option to go somewhere else, they have to be better, and that should make the conditions better for everyone.
Sure, sure. What are you seeing in this milestone?
Well, I think it's a big deal. Now, we've always had a version of school choice.
Right.
And it's a choice of, well, where are you going to move?
Sure.
Because like a lot of parents, one of the things I did when we were looking at where we're going to, buy a house is you pull out great schools and look at the map. And so we picked one there. We found a house we could afford in a decent school district, maybe a little more house than we could afford because we wanted the school district. And a lot of people do that, but that's not an option for folks that don't have, that kind of money. And so this is a way of expanding choice to folks that didn't have it otherwise, or for people for whatever reason are not satisfied. They don't think that their child is getting the kind of service that they need to help them
Or
thrive.
their child needs something very specific
Right.
that a big environment can't.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly. And so this is going to be a reoccurring issue, and it's also a politically divisive issue.
Sure.
I saw polling that one of the big drivers among Republicans is that about half, this was a poll that was taken last year, a nationwide poll, about half of Republicans were not satisfied with how much their local schools listen to them or their ability to have input in their child's education.
Right.
Whereas more than half of Democrats were very satisfied or mostly satisfied with that. So there's a definite divide in perception about how schools are responsive to the needs of students and the desire of parents, and I think that is driving part of this goal. And on the flip side, a lot of Democrats are claiming, well, this is just taking money away from private schools, but this is a model. Public schools. Thank you. But this is a model of the funding following the child rather than the building, and I think this is something. That's a fundamental truth that I think a lot of people adhere to. They hold on to that. They think that's a good idea. And if the student is taken out of the public system, in theory at least, the public schools shouldn't have to spend as much money. The issue though is that a lot of the money going to increase funding for schools is going to administrative costs. And that is an inefficiency that probably needs to get addressed pretty quickly so that we can get more of that public school money into the classrooms rather than into the administrator's office.
Absolutely. All right, we're going to be following this story and plus a lot more going on as the General Assembly is not expected to come back next week, so we'll be able to dig in more on these things. But check out carolinajournal.com and johnlocke.org for the latest on everything we've been talking about. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.